She was invisible, plus size, black. A secretary in a Korean empire built on blood and silence. The night a bullet meant for the most feared mafia boss in Asia went wide. She was the one who pulled him to safety. One night, one secret. 6 months later, her coat couldn't hide it anymore. And when the man who terrified boardrooms and buried enemies finally placed his hands on her belly and felt his child kick back, nothing in Seoul would ever be the same. If this story already has you, drop a like right now. Comment the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Stay with me until the very end. You will not regret it. The gala had been Ji-tae's idea. Everything always was. Kang Ji-tae did not attend events. He presided over them. There was a difference, and every person inside the Grand Celestia Hotel's 42nd floor ballroom understood it in their bones the moment he walked through the double doors at precisely 8:50, not 8, not 8:30. 8:15, because arriving exactly on time was the habit of men who feared being late, and arriving fashionably late was the theater of men who needed to be noticed. Ji-tae required neither. He arrived when he decided to arrive, and the room rearranged itself around him like water parting for a stone dropped from height. He was 41 years old. Black hair shot through with early silver at the temples, a jaw that looked carved rather than grown. His suit was charcoal, bespoke, and he wore it the way soldiers wore armor, not for beauty, but for function. He moved through clusters of Korea's wealthiest industrialists, politicians with clean public records and dirty private ledgers, and foreign executives who had flown in from Singapore, Tokyo, and Frankfurt specifically to be in the same room as him, to shake the hand that controlled the largest private logistics network in East Asia and never once appeared in a single regulatory filing under his real name. Kang Logistics Solutions, on paper, was run by a board of directors whose faces appeared in annual reports, and who gave careful, unremarkable interviews to financial journalists. Ji-tae's name appeared nowhere in the corporate structure. It did not need to. The men who mattered knew who owned the silence inside every boardroom. Amara Brooks stood 12 feet behind him and 3 steps to the left. This was her position. Always. Close enough to be useful, far enough to be forgettable. She had a leather portfolio tucked against her left arm that contained his evening schedule, the names and brief biographies of every significant attendee, a printed seating chart for the formal dinner that would follow cocktail hour, and 2 of the folded message cards that Ji-tae preferred for passing written instructions when electronic communication felt too visible. She also carried, in the right interior pocket of her blazer, a thin portable charger for his phone, 2 Advil in a small paper fold because he got tension headaches he would never admit to, and a backup business card holder because he had once crushed one during a negotiation and needed a replacement without breaking conversational momentum. She had worked as his executive secretary for 3 years. In that time, she had cataloged every preference, every tick, every small tell that signaled whether a meeting was proceeding to his satisfaction or quietly souring. She knew he touched his right cufflink when he was bored. She knew he went still, completely, unnaturally still, when someone said something that made him decide to remember them in a specific way. She knew he drank his coffee at exactly 68 degrees Celsius and that he would drink it cold before he would ask someone to reheat it, because asking for things twice was not something he did. She knew all of this and remained, to the man himself, essentially invisible. Not deliberately. That was the thing she'd long since stopped being angry about and had simply accepted as mechanical fact. Ji-tae did not ignore her the way some executives ignored staff, with the lazy contempt of men who confuse deference with stupidity. He simply operated on a frequency where she did not register as a person who warranted sustained attention. She was a function, an extension of his operational capacity, exceptional at her work, invisible in every other sense. She was also, at this particular moment, trying very carefully not to let the physical discomfort she'd been managing for the last 6 hours show on her face. The blazer she was wearing was 2 sizes larger than her usual. So was the blouse beneath it. She'd selected both with deliberate care that morning, standing in her apartment bathroom and studying the mirror with the clear-eyed pragmatism she applied to every professional problem. The fabric draped correctly. The cut was conservative enough to read as a style choice rather than concealment. She'd worn this combination 3 times in the past 2 weeks, varying it enough that no pattern was obvious. She was 31 years old, she was 5'6", and she was, at this precise moment, 23 weeks and 4 days pregnant, which meant the situation was no longer something she could manage indefinitely through careful wardrobe choices. And the timeline she was working against had become, in the last 72 hours, genuinely urgent. She had a flight booked. One way. Seoul to New York, departing in 9 days. 9 days. She just needed to get through 9 more days without anything going wrong. The cocktail hour unfolded the way these things always did. The careful choreography of wealth performing itself for other wealth. Everyone watching everyone. The conversations that sounded like pleasantries and functioned as intelligence gathering. Amara moved through the room in Ji-Tai's peripheral orbit, refilling his informational blind spots as needed, passing him the Advil disguised in a handshake when she clocked the particular tightness around his left eye that meant the headache was starting, intercepting a junior attaché from the German trade delegation who had been working up to an interruption Ji-Tai would not have appreciated. She was good at this. The invisibility that had shadowed her whole life, the particular blindness that people developed around a plus-size black woman in rooms dominated by thin, pale, powerful men, had become, in this work, a professional superpower. She moved without friction. She gathered information without resistance. People said things near her they would not have said if they'd registered her as someone worth guarding themselves against. It was useful. It was also, on certain nights when she was tired enough to let herself feel things, quietly devastating. She was thinking about the flight again, mentally rehearsing the logistics of the next 9 days for probably the 40th time, when the first shot was fired. The sound was wrong for the space. That was the first thing her brain processed, before the word gunshot had even fully assembled itself. A sharp, flat crack that didn't belong inside a room built for string quartets and champagne flutes. For approximately 1 second, every person in the ballroom did the same thing, froze. Then the second shot came, and the freeze shattered into chaos. The screaming started from the right side of the room, near the window-facing tables. Amar's eyes were already moving, scanning, assessing, and she located Ji-Tai in under a second because she always knew where he was. He was standing near the center of the room with 2 of his captains flanking him and a Singaporean shipping magnate he'd been managing a deal with, and he was the only person in the immediate vicinity who hadn't flinched. He turned his head toward the sound, calm, measuring. His head of security, Park Hyun-soo, materialized from the perimeter and had Ji-Tai's arm in one hand and was already moving toward the private corridor at the rear of the ballroom. Ji-Tae was moving with him, not being pulled, moving, because Ji-Tae did not get pulled anywhere, but there were people flooding the same corridor, panicked guests crushing toward exits, and Hyun-soo's 2-man team was being separated by the surge. Amara was already moving before she'd made a conscious decision to. She knew the floor plan of this hotel down to the fire exit placements and the service stairwells. She'd reviewed it 3 days ago when she'd coordinated the event logistics, which was her job, which meant she knew something Hyun-soo's team apparently didn't factor for right now. The private executive lounge 2 doors down the service corridor was accessible through a secondary keypad, and she had the code because she'd arranged Ji-Tae's pre-event briefing there 4 hours ago. And the door locked from the inside and it had no windows. She pushed through the crowd against the grain of the panic, which was its own kind of terrifying. Bodies moving hard in the opposite direction, an elbow catching her ribs, someone's shoulder hitting her left side, and she kept her right arm folded tight against her body, protecting, instinctive, and got to the service corridor door and shouldered through it. Ji-Tae was there. Hyun-soo was there, separated from his team, his jacket torn at the shoulder. 2 civilians who'd taken the same corridor by accident were there, already moving past toward the stairwell. Ji-Tae looked at her. For the first time in 3 years, she had his complete and undivided attention, and the circumstances were extraordinary enough that she simply used it. "The executive lounge," she said, 12 meters down. "I have the code. No windows, locks from inside." A beat. 1 second, maybe less. "Move," Ji-Tae said. She moved first, and he followed her, which was not a thing that had ever happened before in 3 years of working for him. She punched the keypad code in without fumbling. Her hands were shaking slightly, she was aware of that, but the muscle memory carried it. And the door opened, and the 3 of them got inside, and she hit the interior lock, and they stood in the sudden silence of a room that smelled like leather furniture and climate-controlled air, and the quiet of a space insulated from the chaos outside. Ji-Tae was breathing, controlled, measured breaths, the kind that were controlled on purpose. He looked at Hyun-soo first, a look that was its own conversation, rapid and private, then pulled his phone and was speaking to someone in a low, flat voice before Amara had even fully registered that she needed to breathe too. She pressed her back against the wall beside the door and let herself take 3 slow breaths. Her ribs hurt where the elbow had caught her. Her left side ached. She kept her right arm across her body anyway. Pressure, reassurance, habit. The lounge was furnished with a long leather sofa, 2 armchairs, a bar cart that no one was touching, and muted lighting. Ji-tae paced while he spoke on the phone. 4 steps, turn. 4 steps, turn. Controlled. The only tell was the cufflink. He touched it once, twice, and stopped himself. Amara sat down on the edge of the sofa because her legs were less steady than she wanted them to be, and she set the portfolio down on the cushion beside her with the careful movements of someone managing their physical state with limited resources. Hyun-soo was at the door, listening to something through his earpiece, relaying information in clipped Korean. Ji-tae ended his call. He stood in the center of the room for a moment and looked at her. Actually looked at her, the kind of assessment he applied to everything he wanted to understand, and said, "You knew the code." "I arranged your briefing here this afternoon," she said. "It was on your schedule. You moved against the crowd. It was the fastest way." He considered her for another second. Then, unexpectedly, he said, "You're shaking." "Adrenaline." She kept her voice flat, professional. "It'll pass." His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted in a way she couldn't categorize. He looked at her for a moment longer than the exchange warranted, and then Hyun-soo said something from the door, and Ji-tae's attention moved and the moment closed. She sat with her arm across her body and her portfolio on the cushion beside her and waited for her hands to stop trembling. The next 40 minutes were operational. Hyun-soo's team secured the floor. 2 of Ji-tae's captains appeared at the lounge door and were admitted. The police arrived, the public-facing officers, not the ones who reported through different channels, and the room was processed through the formal procedures that Ji-tae navigated with the practiced ease of a man who had done this before. A statement was given, details were managed. The shooter had been a contracted professional, hired through a brokerage that Ji-tae's intelligence network had already flagged as connected to a rival Busan operation that had been making territorial moves for the last 8 months. Not random, targeted, not successful. These things happen. Amara watched all of this from a chair in the corner of the lounge where she had retreated, portfolio open, functioning. When Ji-tae needed a document retrieved or a contact number, she had her phone out and the information ready before he finished the sentence. She did her job. The shaking had passed. She was fine. She was always fine. It was 2:17 in the morning when the last of the officials left, and the security detail consolidated and the evening officially became history. Hyun-soo stepped out to coordinate the vehicle arrangement. Ji-tae was standing at the bar cart, not drinking, just standing, and Amara was collecting herself to leave, gathering the portfolio, finding her phone, when he spoke. "Sit down?" Not a question. She sat. He turned from the bar cart and looked at her, and this was a different look from the ones earlier. Less operational, something quieter, something she didn't have a protocol for. "That was well done, Sheikh," he said. In 3 years, he had never said those words to her directly. She'd received performance reviews through HR. She'd received efficiency scores on quarterly assessments. She had never received 3 words from him that had no operational content. She didn't know what to do with them, so she said, "Thank you." He nodded once, moved to the sofa and sat down heavily. Not carelessly, but with the specific weight of a man letting his body acknowledge that the last 2 hours had cost something. He loosened his cufflink, ran a hand back through his hair. Then he looked at her again and said, "Open the bar." She did. She poured whiskey for him. Neat, no ice, she knew this, and sat back down on the far end of the sofa because the armchairs were too far away for the conversation he seemed to be starting, and she poured herself club soda from the cart because it was 2 in the morning and she needed something in her hands. They sat in silence for a moment. "You've worked for me for 3 years, he said. Not a question. Accounting. Yes. You know everything about how I operate. Most of it, she said carefully. What's relevant to my function? Something almost moved in his expression. You know I'm not just a logistics executive. This was not a question either. It was a test with a correct answer and an incorrect one. And she had been navigating tests like this her entire career. I know you're effective, she said. I know your organization is complex. I know my job is to support your professional schedule and protect your informational security, and I do that. He looked at her steadily. You're not afraid of me. Should I be? A long pause. Most people are. Most people haven't spent 3 years managing your calendar, she said. You become less terrifying when I know you need Advil before high-stakes meetings. Something shifted in his face. For a moment, a brief, genuine moment, it looked almost like he was going to smile. No one's ever said that to me before. I imagine not. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. Less guarded, more tired. Two people in a locked room at 2 a.m. after something violent had happened, the adrenaline finally metabolizing into something quieter and stranger. She should have left. She had every reason to leave. It was late, she was tired, she had things she was managing. 9 days, a timeline, a plan. She should have stood up and said goodnight and walked out with the portfolio under her arm and maintained exactly the professional distance she'd maintained for 3 years. She didn't stand up. She wasn't entirely sure why, except that the night had stripped something away from both of them, some protective operational layer, and she was tired, deeply, bone-tired, the kind of tired that the pregnancy had made chronic and that the fear of the last months had made worse. And for the first time in a very long time, she was sitting next to another human being who had also just been afraid, and the room was quiet and the door was locked. They talked, which was not something they had ever done. Not briefing, not reporting. Talked. The halting, exploratory kind of conversation that happens when two people are discovering the other person isn't who they assumed. He asked her where she was from. She told him Atlanta originally, then New York for her MBA, then Seoul, because the position had been exceptional, and she'd wanted to see if she could build something new somewhere unfamiliar. He listened. Not performatively, actually listened the way he listened to intelligence, which was with his whole attention. She asked him, carefully, how he'd built what he'd built. He considered the question for a long time before answering, which told her the question mattered to him. He talked about his father, about an organization inherited rather than built, and the difference between those things, about the weight of operating in two worlds simultaneously, the legitimate corporate structure and everything beneath it, and never being able to fully inhabit either one. It was, she realized, the most honest conversation she'd ever had with him, possibly the most honest conversation she'd had with anyone in Seoul. He was, she also realized, looking at her differently, not the way men had looked at her before. The evaluating, categorizing kind of look that took in her size and her blackness and made a series of rapid, lazy conclusions. He was looking at her the way he looked at problems he found genuinely interesting. It was 2:50 in the morning when he moved closer on the sofa, and the distance between them became a different kind of thing, and she made a choice. She knew, even as she made it, that it was complicated. She knew the architecture of their professional relationship and everything that complicated what happened next. She knew she was a woman with a plan and a timeline and a one-way flight in 9 days. She made the choice anyway, because she was tired of being invisible, because the night had been terrifying, and she was still alive, and so was he. Because he was looking at her like she was a person he wanted to know, and it had been a very long time since anyone had looked at her that way. The night passed. She was, in the weeks that followed, exactly who she had always been. She arrived at the 38th floor offices of Kang Logistics Solutions at 8:45 every morning. She managed his schedule with the precision she'd always managed it. She attended meetings, produced briefs, anticipated needs, remained invisible in all the ways that had always made her effective. Jite was, in the days after the gala, different with her in small ways that she registered and he might not have been aware of. He held eye contact slightly longer than he used to. He said thank you directly to her once in front of 2 junior executives, which caused a brief confusion in the room because it was not something he typically did with staff. He asked once, when she brought his morning briefing, how she was, and the question was not perfunctory. There was something behind it that waited for a real answer. She gave him a professional one. She gave him a professional one because by that point she was 4 weeks past the night of the gala, and she had taken 3 pregnancy tests on 3 different mornings, and the result had been the same all 3 times, and the timeline lined up with a precision that left no ambiguity. She had sat on the edge of her bathtub the morning after the 3rd test and done what she did with every problem. She had thought it through. The father of her child was the Mafia boss of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in East Asia. He did not know she existed as a person beyond her professional function. What had happened between them had been real. She was honest enough with herself to not diminish it, but it had also happened in a particular context, in an extraordinary night, and she had no illusions about what it was and what it wasn't. More urgently, she knew enough about how his world worked to understand with cold clarity what being pregnant with Kang Jitai's child would mean. She had moved through the edges of his organizational world for 3 years. She had seen what happened to people who became leverage. A child, his heir, would not be a private family matter. It would be a strategic asset, a vulnerability, a piece on a board. She would spend the rest of her life managed, protected, perhaps, but managed. Her movements tracked, her associations monitored, her freedom, the fundamental individual freedom she'd spent her whole adult life building, quietly dissolved into the requirements of someone else's empire. She would not do that, not to herself, not to her child. She booked the flight. The pregnancy progressed the way pregnancies do, with its own indifferent biological logic, unconcerned with her plans or her timeline or the careful professional performance she was maintaining at 38 floors above Gangnam-gu. She was competent at hiding it, and the particular invisibility she'd always carried worked for her now in ways she hadn't anticipated. People didn't study her body the way they studied thin women's bodies. The expanded wardrobe read as personal style, the way she moved carefully, the way she took the elevator instead of the stairs, the way she sometimes pressed a hand briefly against her lower back. These were details that nobody tracked. She was 17 weeks when the nausea started being something she had to actively manage at work. She kept ginger candies in her desk drawer and peppermint oil in her bag, and she excused herself to the bathroom when she needed to, and she pushed through the rest. She was 20 weeks when the movement started. Subtle, internal, a private secret between her body and the life growing inside it. And she stood in the bathroom on a Tuesday afternoon and pressed both hands flat against her stomach and told herself to hold it together for 4 more weeks. 4 more weeks and she'd be on the plane. 4 more weeks and this chapter of her life would close, and she'd begin a different one. Somewhere she controlled the terms. She had a plan. She did not account for Seo Min-ho. Min-ho was 53 years old, Senior Director of International Operations, and had been with the organization for 11 years. He was the kind of man who had built his career on knowing which way the wind blew and positioning himself accordingly. Not a standout, not a visionary, but meticulous and politically careful and reliably useful enough that he'd risen through the layers of Kang logistics to a position of genuine operational weight. He was also, as Amara discovered on a Tuesday morning in the 14th week of her pregnancy, while auditing a third-quarter variance report she'd been asked to cross-reference by the CFO, systematically embezzling from the organization's international transit accounts. She almost missed it. The scheme was genuinely sophisticated. Layered vendor invoicing, a network of shell entities across 3 jurisdictions, payments routed through legitimate subsidiary expenses in a way that would have passed a standard audit. But Amara had an unusual financial mind. She had an MBA from Wharton. She'd spent 2 years in forensic accounting before pivoting to executive administration, and she noticed things in numbers that other people's eyes passed over. She spent 3 days going back through 12 months of records before she was certain. The total was 94 million won across 7 accounts over 18 months, small enough in each instance to stay beneath threshold triggers, large enough, accumulated, to matter. She sat with it for a week, thought about what to do. The right answer was obvious. Report it to Jitai or to the internal financial oversight structures that fed back to him. She had the documentation. The pattern was clear. It was her professional obligation. She was also 21 weeks pregnant and had a flight booked in 3 weeks, and reporting financial fraud to the Mafia boss whose child she was carrying while trying to quietly disappear felt like the precise kind of move that unraveled exit strategies. She decided to document everything, seal it, and leave it for whoever came after her with enough information to act on it. Anonymous, clean. Not her problem once she was on the plane. Minho, however, was watching. She didn't know this. She hadn't been careless. She'd accessed the records during normal working hours through systems she had legitimate clearance for, nothing that should have flagged. But Minho had been in his position long enough to have built his own informal monitoring systems for accounts that mattered to him. And when someone ran an extended comparative analysis across the 7 accounts where he'd been working, a quiet alert had tripped somewhere. He came to her office on a Thursday afternoon. He closed the door. He sat down across from her desk with the particular relaxed confidence of a man who believed he held all the leverage. And he said, "I think we have something to discuss." She looked at him across her desk and said nothing. He laid out what he knew, that she'd accessed the records, that the access pattern was unusual, that he was confident about what she'd found. Then he told her what he wanted, minor adjustments to 3 of the account reconciliations. Nothing drastic, enough to muddy the documentation she'd compiled, enough to make the pattern less readable. He said this calmly, conversationally, like it was a negotiation between equals. Then he said, "And you'll want to consider your own situation, of course, given your condition." The room went very quiet. She kept her face still. Her hands were flat on the desk, and she did not let them move. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd done this before. "You're very good at your job, Ms. Brooks. You've kept it very well hidden. But I've had more time than you realize to observe, and there are certain things a person with attention to detail notices, regardless of what clothing choices are made." He tilted his head slightly. "I'd imagine the child's father doesn't know. That seems like the kind of information he would have acted on." She said nothing. "Alter the records," he said, "and this conversation never happened. Decline, and I start asking questions in the right places." He left. She sat in her office for 45 minutes without moving, working through the new landscape. The timeline had collapsed. She couldn't wait 3 weeks. She needed to get on a plane in the next 48 hours, which meant booking an emergency change, which meant the costs were significant but irrelevant, which meant she needed to go home tonight and pack and leave tomorrow, and she could not. Her phone lit up on the desk. A calendar notification. Meeting with Minho's operations team tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., which she was expected to attend as GTA's executive representative. She stared at the notification. She began packing her personal items from her desk with quiet, methodical movements. The parking garage beneath the Kang Logistics building was lit with the flat, bluish-white of fluorescent tubes, 8 levels of concrete, and the smell of exhaust and the sound of distant traffic filtered through the ventilation. Amar had taken to leaving late to avoid the lobby crowds, which also meant the garage was almost empty when she reached her car at the far end of level 3. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. Minho had not come alone. There was another man, younger, heavy, the specific kind of physical bulk that signaled purpose. And they came from between 2 parked vehicles with the unhurried approach of people who weren't worried about witnesses because they'd checked. "You didn't make the changes," Minho said. She had her car key in her hand and her phone in her bag, and she was doing the rapid, cold math of the situation. Screaming would echo. Running was, she had assessed this in less than a second, not viable. She was 23 weeks pregnant, and she was in a parking garage, and the nearest security checkpoint was 2 levels up. "You should think carefully about this," she said. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. He nodded to the other man. The hit was hard, a shoulder blow that knocked her sideways against the door of the car beside her. She got her arms up, kept herself from falling, kept her right side protected, instinct overriding everything. And then there was a hand in her hair and something slammed into the car door, and she was pressed against it, her face sideways against cold metal, and she was breathing in sharp, shallow pulls, and thinking not the stomach, not the stomach. The pressure released. There was a sound of impact that had nothing to do with her. Then another one. Then Minho's voice saying something sharp and afraid. She turned. Park Hyun-soo was standing 4 feet away from her. The younger man was on the ground. Minho was backed against the opposite vehicle with his wrists pinned by Hyun-soo's grip and his face the color of wet concrete. Hyun-soo was looking at her. His expression was, as it always was, professionally blank. His eyes moved down, briefly, assessing, and then came back to her face, and something happened in them that was not blank, and she understood that he had seen what he had seen. "Are you injured?" he said. Not quite a question. She straightened up from the car door. Her head was ringing. Her left shoulder ached. She kept her right arm against her body and made herself breathe and said, "I need to go home." "Miss Brooks." His voice was very quiet, very even. "I need to take you to Mr. Kang. I know," he said. "I'm sorry." And something in the way he said "I'm sorry," not apologetically, but with the weight of a man who understood what he was asking her to walk into, told her that the next move was not hers to make anymore. She closed her eyes. She opened them. "All right," she said. Min-ho, held by his wrists, made a sound that might have been protest. Hyun-soo looked at him once, briefly, and the sound stopped. The elevator to the penthouse was glass-walled and fast, and Amara watched Seoul spread below her. The density of light across the Han River basin, the sharp geometry of Gangnam towers against the black. And she was aware of her own heartbeat and the small, separate movement inside her that had nothing to do with fear. She pressed her hand flat against her side. She thought, 9 days. She thought, not anymore. The elevator reached the top floor. The doors opened. Kang Ji-tae was standing in the center of the living room with a phone in his hand that he'd been mid-conversation on, and he looked at Hyun-soo, and then he looked at her. At her face. At the way she was holding herself. At the arm pressed against her body. And he lowered the phone without ending the call, and said nothing. He just looked at her. And something in the way he looked made it suddenly, devastatingly difficult to maintain the composure she'd been maintaining since the parking garage, since the office, since the Thursday afternoon when Min-ho had sat across her desk and smiled. She stood in the doorway of the penthouse of the most powerful criminal in East Asia, in a coat 2 sizes too large, and tried very hard not to fall apart. Ji-tae said something to Hyun-soo in Korean without looking away from her. Hyun-soo answered in 2 words and left, closing the door behind him. They were alone. "Sit down," Ji-tae said. His voice was different from the way it was in meetings, different from the way it was at the gala or in the locked executive lounge at 2 in the morning. It was carefully, deliberately quiet, the voice of a man moderating something. She sat down on the edge of the nearest chair, and he crossed the room and crouched down to her level, which was not a thing she had ever seen him do, and he looked at her face. "Who hit you?" "Min-ho. He brought someone." A pause. "Why?" She looked at him. "I found evidence of embezzlement. He wanted me to alter records. I didn't." Ji-tae was very still. "Why didn't you come to me?" It was the question she'd been dreading, because the honest answer was also the answer that detonated everything, and she was sitting in his penthouse running out of ways to avoid the detonation, and the small movement against her right side chose that exact moment to happen again, and she closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, Ji-tae was looking at her coat. She saw the moment his eyes found the shape that the coat, at 23 weeks, could no longer completely disguise, the slight change in the line of it, the way she held her arm, the particular way she'd sat, slightly sideways, protective. He looked up at her face. She watched him understand. The silence in the room changed entirely. He reached out slowly, and she should have moved back, should have turned away, should have said something that reestablished any of the barriers she'd spent months building. She did none of those things. She sat there and let him take the lapel of her coat in both hands and fold it slowly back. The black fabric of her blouse was stretched across an unmistakably, undeniably pregnant abdomen. Ji-tae did not move. He did not speak. He was crouched in front of her and his hands had gone still on the lapels of her coat, and he was looking at her stomach with an expression she had never seen on his face, had never imagined seeing, and the silence stretched until it was almost unbearable. "How long?" he said. His voice was barely sound. 23 weeks, she whispered. He looked up from her stomach. He looked at her face, and she saw, in the eyes of a man who had built an empire on control, and never once shown a room full of powerful people anything he didn't intend to show them. She saw him shatter. Not loudly, not with anger, just the visible physical impact of a truth arriving that reorganized everything. He reached out and laid one hand, flat, careful, against the side of her stomach. The baby kicked. Amara felt it, and she saw him feel it, and something broke open in her chest that she had been keeping sealed for months, and her vision blurred, and she was crying before she fully registered she was crying, quiet and helpless, and she couldn't stop. "It's yours," she said, though he hadn't asked, because he needed to hear it and she needed to say it. It's yours. I'm sorry. I had a flight. I didn't know how to. Stop, he said quietly. She stopped. His hand was still on her stomach. His head was bowed slightly. When he looked up again, his eyes were wet. Not tears, not quite, or not yet, but the edge of something. When did you plan to leave? The question was quiet. It was the quietest thing in the room. 9 days, she said. He looked at her for a long time. That's not going to happen, he said. And she didn't know. In this moment, sitting in this penthouse, his hand on her stomach, her plans dissolving, her whole carefully constructed exit strategy coming apart, whether those 4 words were a threat or a promise. She was about to find out. He didn't move his hand. That was the thing she kept coming back to, later, when she was trying to reconstruct the sequence of that night in some order that made sense. He had his hand flat against her stomach, and the baby had kicked and he hadn't moved his hand, and Kang Ji-tai, a man who did not hold still for anything, who moved through rooms and decisions and people with the constant forward momentum of someone who'd learned early that stillness was vulnerability, held completely still. She could hear him breathing. 9 days, he said again. Not a question this time. Something harder. I had it planned. Her voice was steadier than she felt. The flight was booked. I was going to send a formal resignation the morning I left. I had a reason drafted. She paused. I wasn't going to tell you. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Ji-tae's jaw moved. Once. He looked down at his hand on her stomach, then up at her face, and the thing in his eyes was not anger, not yet, but it was adjacent to it, pressed up against it, trying to decide. Why? He said. One word. The whole weight of the night in it. She didn't look away from him. She'd decided, somewhere in the elevator ride up, that she was done performing composure she didn't have. Because I know what this world is. I've worked inside it for 3 years. I know what a child means in your position. What this child would mean. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life as a managed asset. Silence. That's what you thought I'd do. That's what the logic of your world does, she said. I wasn't making a judgment about your character. I was making a calculation about structural reality. Something moved across his face. Not quite anger, not quite hurt. Something that didn't have a clean name. He stood up from the crouch, slowly, like a man managing himself, and walked to the window. Seoul spread below, indifferent, brilliant, its 10 million lights doing what city lights do, making the darkness look like it had been defeated. He stood there for a while. She waited. Yun-soo knew, he said. He saw tonight, in the garage. That was the first time anyone... He didn't tell me. He'd known for approximately 40 minutes. Ji-tae turned from the window. He should have told me immediately. The edge in his voice was the one she recognized from meetings when someone had failed to deliver information he considered essential. Professional, cold. The voice of a man who had built an organization on the premise that information withheld was loyalty fractured. Don't, she said. He looked at her. Don't punish him for something he had no framework to navigate. He found me in a parking garage with your child and brought me here in under an hour. He did his job. The silence stretched. Ji-tae moved away from the window. He walked to the kitchen, a long open space of dark stone counters and professional appliances, and stood at the counter with his back to her and his hands pressed flat on the surface and his head slightly bowed. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the controlled breathing rhythm she recognized. After a moment he said without turning, "Are you hurt?" From the garage. "My shoulder. Nothing structural. I'll have a doctor here in 20 minutes. I don't need... It's not optional." He turned then and his face had resolved into something harder and more familiar. The operational face, the one that managed things. You're 23 weeks pregnant and someone put hands on you tonight. A doctor is coming. That's not a discussion. She looked at him. Okay. He pulled his phone and made the call. 3 sentences, precise, and it was done. Then he stood in the kitchen with the phone in his hand and looked at her across the living room and said, "Tell me about Min-ho." So she told him. All of it. The variance report, The pattern she'd found, the 3 days of documentation, the Thursday meeting, what Minho had said and how he'd said it, the implicit threat under the polite language. Jitae listened without interrupting, which was how he always listened to intelligence. Fully, quietly, storing it. When she finished, he said, "You have the documentation. On an encrypted drive, in my apartment. I'll have it retrieved. I'd rather get it myself." A pause. I'm not under house arrest." Her voice was level. "I'm aware of the situation, and I'm aware of the risks, and I'm telling you I would like to retrieve my own belongings from my own apartment myself, with whatever security arrangement you think is appropriate. I'm not going to fight you on the security, but I'm telling you what I want." He studied her. "All right," he said. She hadn't expected that. The concession moved through her strangely, not relief exactly, something more unsettled. The doctor came 40 minutes later. A woman in her 50s, quiet and competent, who examined Amara with the practiced efficiency of someone who had worked for people who required absolute discretion and had made peace with that a long time ago. The shoulder was bruised, not damaged. The baby's heartbeat, checked with a portable Doppler the doctor produced from her bag, was steady and strong. Amara lay on the leather sofa with the cool sensor pressed against the side of her stomach and listened to that sound fill the room. The fast, rhythmic percussion of a heart that didn't know about parking garages or embezzlement or 9-day escape plans. And she kept her eyes on the ceiling and breathed. She was aware that Jitae had gone very still on the other side of the room. She didn't look at him. When the doctor left, Jitae stood in the center of the room and said, "You're staying here tonight. I have an apartment, which Minho knows the address of, which is accessible to anyone with access to employee records." He wasn't arguing. He was just stating the geography of the situation. "Tonight you stay here. Tomorrow we discuss the rest." She wanted to object. She reached for the architecture of an objection and found that the ground beneath it was genuinely unstable. Minho had brought someone to the parking garage. She didn't know what else he was capable of or who else he'd built arrangements with. Her apartment was not a secured location. "Fine," she said. "Tonight." He showed her to a guest room that was larger than her entire apartment and left her there without ceremony, which she appreciated. She stood in the room for a long time after the door closed, one hand on her stomach, listening to the city below. She thought, this is not how this was supposed to go. She thought, I know. She didn't sleep well. The baby moved at 3 a.m., which it had taken to doing with increasing regularity, and she lay on her back in the dark of Jitae's guest room and stared at the ceiling and thought about the documentation on the encrypted drive in her apartment desk drawer, and about Minho's face in the parking garage, and about the look on Jitae's face when the baby kicked against his palm. By 5:30, she gave up on sleep and sat at the small desk in the corner and opened her laptop and started working. Because work was the thing she knew how to do when everything else was uncertain. She rebuilt the documentation from memory, not the raw files, those were on the drive, but the structural map of Minho's scheme, the accounts, the timeline, the shell entities. She laid it out in clean columns and let the logic of it settle onto the screen, and it was cleaner than she remembered, tighter, more complete. The man had been running this for 18 months and had been careful, but careful people left patterns, and patterns were the thing she was built to find. She was deep enough in it that she didn't hear the door open. "You've been awake for hours." She startled. Genuinely startled, her hands coming off the keyboard, and turned to find Jitae standing in the doorway in a dark pullover and trousers that were too pressed and deliberate for someone who'd slept, which told her he hadn't slept either. "You should knock," she said. The light was on. He moved into the room, and she turned her laptop screen slightly, not to hide it, she wasn't hiding it, but he was already looking at it. He came and stood behind her chair and looked at the screen. He didn't say anything for a while. "You rebuilt this from memory," he said. "Preliminary structure. The detail is on the drive. This is preliminary." It wasn't really a question. He was looking at the scope of it, the reach. "He's been running this for 18 months. At minimum. I found 18 months of clean documentation. The earlier period would require access to archived records I didn't have clearance for." Jitae pulled the second chair from against the wall and sat down beside her. Close. Closer than professional distance. She was aware of it and chose not to address it. "Walk me through it," he said. She walked him through it. It took an hour. He asked questions that were precise, technically informed, and completely without the bluster that men who didn't understand finance usually deployed to cover the gaps. He just asked what he didn't know and absorbed the answers. She found herself explaining things she hadn't expected to explain and having to recalibrate how much he already understood, which was more than she'd assumed. When she finished, he sat back and looked at the screen for a moment. "You were going to leave this for someone to find after you were gone," he said. "I was going to leave enough to make the pattern discoverable. Why not just take it, delete it? It was leverage over you." She looked at him sideways. "Because it was also theft from your organization, and I found it, and walking away from that without making it available to be corrected wasn't something I could do." He looked at her. "That's a particular kind of integrity," he said slowly, "for a woman who was planning to take my child to another continent without telling me." The air in the room changed. She turned back to the screen. "I know. I need you to understand what you were going to do." "I understand it completely. Do you?" His voice wasn't raised. That was the thing about Jitai. He didn't raise his voice when he was at his most dangerous. He got quieter. "You found out about my child, and you decided to remove that child from my life based on an assumption about what I would do. You didn't ask me. You didn't give me the option of responding differently than you'd predicted. You just decided." She kept her eyes on the screen. Her jaw was tight. "Yes. And you think that was acceptable?" "I think I had limited information and real fear and made the best decision I could with both." She finally turned and looked at him. "I also think I was wrong about some of it, and I'm sitting in your penthouse at 5:30 in the morning instead of on a plane, so clearly the situation has evolved." A long silence. Jite stood up, walked to the window. The city was lightening at the edges. That particular pre-dawn gray that happened before the sun committed. "My father had a son with a woman outside his marriage," he said. "He was looking at the city, not her. I found out about my half-brother when I was 17. He'd known about the boy for 6 years by then and had done nothing. Hadn't acknowledged him, hadn't brought him into the family, hadn't protected him. The boy grew up knowing who his father was and knowing his father had chosen not to know him." He paused. "He died when he was 19. Circumstances that were traceable back to the fact that he'd been raised without the protection my father's name would have provided." She sat very still. "I'm not my father," Jite said. The words were quiet and very deliberate, and she understood they were the most honest thing he'd said to her since the night of the gala. She looked at the laptop screen, at the columns of numbers that represented 18 months of theft by a man who had looked at her and seen an obstacle. She thought about her own months of calculation, the careful architecture of her exit, the way she'd looked at Jitai and seen a structural threat rather than a person. "I'm not going to apologize for trying to protect my child," she said, "but I'm willing to admit that I made assumptions about you that weren't entirely fair." He turned from the window. "That's not nothing. It's not everything either." He studied her. "No, but it's a place to start." The encrypted drive was retrieved by 9 a.m. Hyun-soo went personally, with 2 people, and the apartment was swept while they were there, and nothing had been disturbed, which meant Min-ho hadn't moved on it yet. Jitai had not brought Hyun-soo in for the conversation Amara had anticipated, and she didn't ask about it. By noon, she had transferred the documentation to a secure system Jitai's technical lead set up in the penthouse's private office, a room she hadn't been in before, fitted with screens and hardware that spoke to an infrastructure well beyond what a legitimate logistics company required, and she had walked 2 of Jitai's senior financial people through the complete structure of the scheme. They were good. Better than she'd expected from organizational insiders. They had the full picture within 3 hours and the expressions of men who had been personally offended by both the theft and the elegance of the construction. Jitai sat at the head of the table and listened and was very quiet in a way that made everyone in the room slightly careful. Min-ho had not come into the office that morning. His assistant had called in a personal emergency on his behalf. The information was noted. "He knows I had him retrieved last night," Jitai said, when the financial team had left and it was the 2 of them and Hyun-soo in the office. "He'll assume I've been given the documentation." "He'll run," Hyun-soo said. "He'll try." Jitai's voice was flat. "Find him." Hyun-soo left. Jitai remained at the head of the table and looked at Amara across it. She was standing at the secondary screen where the documentation was laid out, because sitting had become less comfortable in the last 2 weeks, and she'd stopped pretending otherwise. "You built that in a morning," he said. "I had the structure in my head. The drive had the source files. You could rebuild our entire international financial operation." She looked at him sideways. "That's not a compliment. That's a job offer." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the neighborhood. "The position would come with certain changes to your current contract." "I'm not currently employed," she said. "I quit. Constructively, when my supervisor blackmailed me in an office and then sent someone to assault me in a parking garage. Minho's not your supervisor. He outranks me by 6 grades." Jite stood up from the table, walked around it, slowly, the way he moved when he was thinking. "Stay," he said. "Not here. Though for now, the penthouse is the right security arrangement. Stay in Seoul. Stay connected to the organization." He paused. "Give me the time to show you that the assumption you made about what I'd do was wrong." She turned and faced him fully. He was standing 4 feet away from her, and he looked, in this light, in this room, like a man who was asking rather than instructing, and the difference between those two things mattered more to her than she could easily explain. "I want my own space," she said. "Not this penthouse, a residence I choose with security I agree to. Manageable. I want operational independence within whatever financial work I agree to take on. I report to you, not through layers. That's already how I prefer to work. And the decisions about this child, his name, his education, how he's raised, those are joint decisions. I don't get overridden, not by you, not by anyone in this organization." He met her eyes. Agreed. She waited for the qualifier, for the but that would come in and quietly hollow out each concession. It didn't come. She said, "I'm not saying yes to everything tonight. I'm saying I'll stay. For now. And we figure the rest out." "That's enough," he said. She turned back to the screen and looked at the columns of Minho's betrayal laid out in clean, damning rows, and she thought about the flight she wasn't going to take, and the plan she'd had, and the particular way the world had of making detailed plans redundant. Her phone buzzed on the table. She picked it up. Unknown number. She started to set it down. And then she read the message. 4 words. "You should have left." She stared at it. Jite, who had been moving toward the door, stopped when he heard her breath change. He turned. He crossed the room in 3 strides and looked at the phone in her hand, and she watched him read it, and she watched his face go the specific kind of still it went when he was making a decision that would have permanent consequences. He took the phone from her hand gently, set it on the table face down, looked at her. "He knows you're here," she said. "He knows you're alive," Jite said. "He doesn't know where you are." "He found my personal number." "I know." His jaw was tight. "Hyunsu will have a location on him within the hour. And if he doesn't," she kept her voice even. "Jite, if Minho has connections we haven't mapped yet, if this runs deeper than one corrupt operations director, then we'll find that too. My documentation might not cover everything. There could be other layers, people he brought in, protected accounts, external connections to whoever he was siphoning to." "I know." He put his hand on the back of her chair, not touching her, just there, a physical anchor to the conversation. "I know. This is going to take longer than tonight." She looked at the phone face down on the table. "I should have left," she said quietly, not agreeing with the message, just saying it, the plain fact of the choice that had been available to her 9 days ago, 7 days ago, 2 days ago, and the series of moments where she hadn't taken it. "You're here now," he said. "Yeah." She pressed her hand against her side. The baby moved, slow and rolling, as if registering the tension in the room and deciding not to be moved by it. "I'm here now." His phone went off. He picked it up, listened, said 2 words, ended the call. "Hyunsu found him," he said. She looked up. Jitae's face was the face she'd seen in 3 years of watching him conduct business. Closed, cold, operational. But there was something beneath it tonight that hadn't been there before. Something that had arrived in a parking garage in a penthouse, and a conversation at 5:30 in the morning and hadn't left. "Stay in this room," he said. "Lock it from the inside." "I'm not..." "Amara." His voice was very quiet. Just her name. The sound of it in his mouth, used that directly, stopped her. Please. She held his eyes for a moment. Okay, she said. He moved toward the door. His hand found the frame. Jitai. He stopped. She didn't know what she'd been going to say. She'd said his name without knowing what came after it, which was unlike her, and she stood in the private office of the most dangerous man in Seoul with her hand on her stomach and the evidence of someone else's corruption spread across a screen behind her and a threatening text face down on the table. And she said, "Be careful." He looked at her over his shoulder. For just a second, just one, the operational face was completely gone, and what was underneath it was something raw and real, and not at all what the rest of the world saw when they looked at King Ji Tai. Then it was back. "Lock the door," he said. He left. She stood in the room and listened to his footsteps fade and looked at the phone on the table and the screen on the wall and the city beyond the glass. And she understood with a clarity that settled in her chest like something cold and irreversible that she had passed the point where any of the old choices were still available to her. She wasn't leaving. She wasn't disappearing. She was here, in the middle of it, and whatever came next was going to come with her in it. And for the first time since the Thursday afternoon, when Minho had smiled at her across a desk, that fact felt less like a trap and more like the truth of where she locked the door. The sound of the bolt engaging was small and final, and she stood with her hand still on the lock for a moment, feeling the cold of the metal. And then she turned back to the room and made herself breathe. The screen on the wall still showed Minho's architecture, the columns, the accounts, the 18 months of careful, patient theft rendered in clean lines that looked almost elegant from a distance. She looked at it and thought about the man who had built it. 53 years old, 11 years inside the organization, long enough to understand the structure, long enough to build something inside it that fed another structure entirely, running parallel, invisible, draining. She moved to the secondary terminal and pulled up the archived records she hadn't had clearance for before. She had access now. The technical lead had given her full system credentials 3 hours ago without being asked to explain why, which told her something about how quickly the hierarchy understood what had shifted, and she started going backward. 19 months, 22, 26. She found the earlier entries 40 minutes in. The pattern was different, less refined, the early mistakes of a man still calibrating what he could take without triggering detection. But it was the same architecture, same routing logic, same shell entity structure, just thinner, less developed. She pulled the founding date of the primary shell company. 31 months ago. She sat with that number for a moment. 31 months ago, Minho had incorporated a shell entity in a jurisdiction with favorable opacity laws, and begun, with methodical patience, to build a parallel financial structure inside Kang Logistics that would eventually move 94 million won of the organization's money into accounts that traced, through enough layers to make tracing genuinely difficult, to somewhere she hadn't yet identified. She started tracing. She was 3 layers deep into the shell structure, cross-referencing incorporation records and transit account signatures, when her phone buzzed again. She picked it up without looking away from the screen. Expected Jite. Expected Hyun-soo. The number was different from before, not the unknown number that had sent the 4-word message. A number she recognized, one of the organization's internal coordination lines, the kind used for secure operational communication between senior staff. The message was a document link, encrypted using the organization's own secure transfer protocol, which meant whoever sent it had internal system access. She should have waited. She knew that. Even as she opened it, she should have called Jitai, confirmed the source, followed the protocol she'd helped establish for handling unverified internal communications. She opened it. The document loaded slowly. A financial report. The format was identical to the internal audit report she'd been working with all morning. Her eyes moved down the columns automatically, reading the way she always read data, top line first and then drilling. She got 3 pages in before she understood what she was looking at. She stopped, went back to the top. Read it again, more slowly. The way you read something the second time when the first reading has delivered a result your brain refuses to accept without verification. The shell company she'd been tracing, the primary entity, the one Minho had incorporated 31 months ago, had a co-signatory, not a shell director, not a nominee, A real signatory, with a real name, whose signature appeared on the founding documents and on every major transfer authorization for the entire 31-month period. The name was Park Hyun-soo. She sat very still. The air in the room did not change. The screen did not change. The city beyond the glass maintained its indifferent geometry. None of the physical facts of the space shifted to accommodate what she'd just read, because physical facts don't do that. They just continue. And she sat in the continuing physical facts of the room with Park Hyun-soo's name on a document on her screen and felt the ground drop out from under everything she thought she'd understood about the last 18 hours. Hyun-soo had been in the parking garage. Hyun-soo had intervened. Hyun-soo had brought her here, to this penthouse, to Ji-tae. She thought about that sequence and laid it against what was on the screen, and her mind, the precise, pattern-finding mind that had built a forensic map of Min-ho's entire scheme from a variance report anomaly, began, with the cold efficiency of a machine that doesn't want to reach its conclusion but reaches it anyway, to construct the alternative reading. Hyun-soo had been in the parking garage because he was already there, not because he'd followed her, because he'd known. Because Min-ho, who had Hyun-soo as a co-signatory on the primary shell, would not have sent someone to assault the woman who knew about the scheme without first ensuring that the head of security, the man who would be tasked with investigating that assault, was either absent or controlled. But Hyun-soo had stopped it. She pressed her fingers against her mouth and thought, why stop it? If you're complicit, if you've been complicit for 31 months, why intervene in a parking garage assault that serves the interests of your co-conspirator? Unless the intervention itself was the point. Unless bringing her here, bringing her terrified and pregnant and documented, directly to Ji-tae was not an act of protection, but an act of positioning. Giving Ji-tae exactly the emotional detonation that would consume his attention, his energy, his focus, while somewhere else something moved that required that attention to be elsewhere. She stood up from the terminal. Her hands were not shaking. She noted this with distant clinical interest. Her hands were steady, and her mind was operating with a terrible clarity, and some part of her had understood, from the moment she saw the name on the screen, that panic was a luxury she could not afford right now. She needed to think. She needed to think about what she knew and what she didn't, and what the correct move was when the head of security, the man Ji-tae trusted with his physical safety for 11 years, was a co-signatory on the scheme she'd been brought here to expose. Her phone. Ji-tae's number. She picked it up and called. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, which had never happened in 3 years. Not once. Ji-tae's phone did not go to voicemail. His phone was answered, or it wasn't reachable. And if it wasn't reachable, Hyun-soo's number was the backup. And she was standing here with Hyun-soo's name on a document and Ji-tae's phone going to voicemail, and she dialed again. Voicemail. She set the phone on the table and looked at the locked door and calculated. Ji-tae had left this office with Hyun-soo. He'd said Hyun-soo found Min-ho. He'd left to go... where, exactly? The call had been brief. 2 words in response, then gone. She hadn't asked because she'd understood that operational details in motion weren't her information to hold. She was regretting that now. She unlocked the door. The penthouse beyond the office was quiet and empty in the way of spaces that have been deliberately vacated. No staff visible, no security in the immediate corridor. Which was itself wrong. There were always at least 2 of Ji-tae's people within visual range inside the penthouse perimeter. She stood in the corridor and listened. Nothing. She moved through this penthouse to the main entrance foyer and checked the security panel beside the elevator, the small screen that showed the status of the building's guard rotations. 3 positions that should have been marked active were showing gray. She stared at the panel. Her phone went off in her hand. She answered before the first ring finished. Ms. Brooks. The voice was Hyun-soo's. Calm, measured. The professional voice she'd heard deliver operational information for 3 years. You should sit down. Every muscle in her body went rigid. Where is he? She said. A pause. Mr. Kang is safe. He's being held temporarily in a location. Held. The word came out with no effect. Flat. By whom? This is a complicated situation, Hyun-soo said. I need you to understand that nothing has to happen to anyone if you make the right choice in the next 10 minutes. She was moving while he talked. Back to the office, back to the terminal, pulling up the building security feed on the secondary screen with her free hand, because if she was talking to him, she needed to see what was happening around her. The document you opened, Hyun-soo continued, I sent you that document. I need you to understand the full picture before you make decisions. I understand the full picture, she said. You've been co-signing for 31 months. I've been managing a situation for 31 months. His voice shifted very slightly. Not defensiveness, something more complex. Minho approached me in the 3rd month. He already had the infrastructure built. He told me I could participate or I could be implicated by the documents he'd constructed to suggest I was already involved. I had a choice between certain destruction and managed risk. She found the security feed. Camera 1 in the main corridor was showing nothing. Black screen. Camera 2, the elevator lobby. Black. Camera 3, the external entrance. Black. All of them. You killed the cameras, she said. I needed this conversation to happen without a record. Where is Jitai? He's safe. I need you to believe that, because it's true. I've spent 11 years keeping that man alive, and I'm not going to stop now. But there are people involved in this beyond Minho and me, external investors who put money into the shell structure and expected returns and are not the kind of people who accept disruption of expected returns without response. She sat down because her legs had decided they'd prefer it. Who? A Busan consortium, the same one behind the gala shooting. She closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them. Minho was working with the people who tried to kill him. Minho has been a conduit for the last 8 months. The embezzlement became leverage. They found the scheme, offered him protection in exchange for operational information. He's been feeding them intelligence about Jitae's organizational structure, security rotations, and vulnerabilities. And you. A pause that lasted precisely long enough to be honest. I fed them less than they believed I was feeding them. I was managing containment. Or you were protecting your own position. Both things can be true. She pressed the heel of her hand against her forehead. The baby moved, a sharp kick, as if responding to the spike of cortisol she could feel moving through her system. And she breathed out slowly. What do you want from me? She said. The documentation you've compiled covers the scheme. The external investors don't appear in it. That layer was kept separate. If that documentation is handed to Jitai as it currently exists, he acts on it, and the Busan consortium responds to that action, and the response is not going to be clean. You want me to bury it? I want you to hold it. Give me 48 hours to arrange an exit for the external investors. A financial settlement that closes the exposure and removes the incentive for escalation. Then the documentation becomes clean and the threat dissolves. She looked at the black camera feeds on the screen, at the columns of Minho's scheme on the primary display, at Park Hyun-soo's name in the founding documents, which she'd pulled up in a separate window and which stared back at her with the patient certainty of facts that don't care whether you're ready for them. And if I don't? She said. The pause this time was different, longer. The kind of pause that precedes something the speaker knows will change the conversation permanently. There's a secondary pressure point, Hyun-soo said. The Busan consortium has been building a file on you. Your entry into the organization, your proximity to Jitae, the pregnancy. They've constructed a narrative that positions you as a planted asset, an intelligence operative placed inside Jitae's organization by a competing interest to extract operational information and confirm vulnerabilities. The room felt colder. That's not true, she said. I know that, he said. Jitae would know that if he had time and space to think clearly, but a file that appears to demonstrate it, delivered to the right people inside the organization at the moment when Jitae is already off balance from the revelation about you and the child, would create a crisis of trust that would take weeks to unpick. During those weeks, you would not be safe inside this organization, and neither would the child. She sat with that, the coldness of it, the elegant, horrible architecture of it, the same patience that had built a 31-month financial scheme applied now to a human situation. Use the pregnancy as an emotional detonation to consume Jitae's attention. Use the manufactured file to destroy the trust the detonation creates. Eliminate the person who has the documentation that could unravel everything. You built it, she said quietly. The file. Silence. You built the file on me, she said again. As insurance, in case I became a problem. I built it before I knew who you were, he said. Before tonight. Standard contingency work. If you'd gotten on your plane 9 days ago, it would have never been used. But I didn't. No. Something in his voice shifted. Not guilt. She didn't think he was capable of something that clean, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. The sound of a man who'd been managing a complicated situation for 31 months and was tired of the weight of it. You didn't. She stood up from the chair. She moved to the window. Seoul was fully in daylight now, the pale wash of mid-morning over the grid of the city, and she stood at the glass with her hand on her stomach and looked at it and thought with every clear, cold, precise tool her mind possessed. 48 hours. Hyun-soo wanted 48 hours to negotiate an exit with the Busan Consortium, during which Jitai was being held, a word that had very specific implications in this world, none of them good, and she was standing in a penthouse with dead security cameras and a manufactured file that could destroy her position in the organization. And the man she'd spent one night with and spent months trying to escape was somewhere she didn't know, and his phone was going to voicemail. She turned from the window. I want to speak to him, she said. Jitai, right now. If he's safe, as you say, then put him on the phone. A pause. That's not non-negotiable. Her voice was flat and absolute, and she felt, underneath the fear and the cold and the terrible clarity of the last 20 minutes, something settle into place inside her that had not been there before. Something that had nothing to do with planning or strategy or the careful management of exits. You want my cooperation. You want 48 hours, and you want the documentation held. I want to hear his voice in the next 60 seconds, or this conversation is over, and I start making calls to every number in his organizational directory. A very long pause, then the sound of movement. A door. A brief exchange of voices she couldn't make out, and then Jitae's voice, rough and close. Amara. Just her name. The way he'd said it in the office doorway before he left. Amara. But different now. The sound of a man who was in a room he did not choose and was working hard not to let that show. Are you hurt? She said. No. A controlled pause. You? No. She pressed her hand flat against the glass. I found the file. I know about Hyun-soo. A silence that told her he was absorbing this in the presence of people he couldn't react in front of. How long? 31 months. Another silence. Then, all right. 2 words that contained a complete conversation. I understand what you're telling me. I can't respond to it here. I trust you to handle what comes next. Hyun-soo's voice came back on. Satisfied? She took her hand off the glass. 48 hours, she said. I'll hold the documentation. But I'm not staying in this penthouse with dead cameras and no security. I'm moving. And the moment Jitai is released, not at the end of 48 hours, but the moment your negotiation is in motion, you tell me where he is. That's manageable. And Hyun-soo? She paused. Chose the next words with the care of someone who understood they were the words that would define the next 2 days. If anything happens to him, anything, I don't hold the documentation. I don't give you 48 hours. I send everything I have to every journalist and regulatory body and competing organization on the continent before the hour is out. I have the contacts and the technical ability to do it, and I will not hesitate. The silence that followed was different from all the others. It was the silence of a man recalibrating. Understood, he said. She ended the call. She stood in the penthouse office with the dead cameras and the open documents and the city below, and she felt the specific weight of a situation in which every path forward required her to become someone she had not been before. Not the careful, invisible secretary with the exit strategy, not the woman who made calculated decisions from the safe distance of professional function, but something rawer and more committed and significantly more dangerous. She opened the documentation on the terminal. She began to work, not holding it, not burying it, restructuring it, pulling the external investor layer from the shell company traces, digging through the incorporation records with the access she now had, building the layer that Hyun-soo thought was safely separate. And she was 2 levels deep into the Busan Consortium's financial fingerprints when the terminal pinged with an incoming transfer alert from one of the flagged accounts, and she leaned forward and saw the number and understood that the 48 hours Hyun-soo had asked for was not a negotiation window. It was a liquidation order. She recognized the format immediately, not because she'd seen one before, but because the structure was unmistakable to anyone who understood how shell entities were wound down. The flagged account was being drained, not gradually, not through the layered micro-transfers Min-ho had used for 18 months. A single outbound wire, clean, total. The kind of move you made when you were not negotiating, when you were closing a position and leaving. The timestamp on the transfer was 11 minutes ago. She pulled the destination account and traced it through the first routing layer in under 4 minutes, because she was running on something beyond adrenaline now, some colder fuel that her body had apparently been holding in reserve for exactly this kind of emergency. The destination was a transit account in a jurisdiction she recognized from the shell structure, not the primary one Hyun-soo had used, a parallel architecture she hadn't mapped yet, which meant there was a third layer to this that neither her documentation nor Hyun-soo's controlled confession had covered. She traced the second routing layer. The account behind it was registered to a holding company whose director's name she didn't recognize. She pulled the director's registration records and cross-referenced them against the organizational contacts database she'd been given access to and got nothing. No match, no flag, no connection to anything she could see. She stared at it. Then she pulled the registration date. The holding company had been incorporated 6 days ago. 6 days ago. 2 days before Min-ho had come to her office. Before the parking garage. Before the penthouse and the document and Hyun-soo's phone call. Before any of tonight. Someone had been preparing an exit 6 days ago. Not Min-ho. Min-ho wasn't capable of this level of parallel construction. She'd been inside his scheme for weeks, and she understood its architecture and its limits. And this was different, cleaner, more sophisticated. This was built by someone who had looked at the entire situation from the outside and identified every pressure point and pre-positioned a response to each one before a single move was made. She thought about the gala. 8 months ago, the Busan Consortium making territorial moves, a contracted shooter who missed, and then 8 months of what the organization had read as a stalled offensive and what she was now reading as 8 months of patient, systematic preparation. She thought about Hyun-soo's 48 hours. It wasn't a negotiation window. It was a distraction window. Keep her cooperative, keep the documentation held, keep Jitae contained and off balance and unable to act for long enough that the liquidation completed and the external structure dissolved, and the evidence she'd been building vanished into a jurisdiction that would take months of legal process to penetrate, by which point Min-ho would be gone. The Busan money would be gone, and the manufactured file on Amara Brooks would be the most coherent narrative available for explaining what had happened inside Kang Logistics over the last 31 months. She grabbed her phone, Jitae's number. Voicemail. She didn't leave a message. She ended and immediately called a second number, one she'd memorized 3 years ago as part of the emergency contact protocol she'd established when she started the job. The number for Lee Sung-jin, Jitae's second-in-command for the Eastern Distribution Network, a man she'd spoken to precisely 9 times in 3 years, and who had the specific distinction of being someone Hyun-soo did not control. It rang twice. Ms. Brooks. His voice was careful, aware. I've been trying to reach Mr. Kang for 40 minutes. He's being held. I don't know the location. I need you to find it. A silence that lasted exactly as long as it took a man to decide whether to treat an executive secretary as a reliable source of operational intelligence. How certain are you? Certain enough that I'm calling you instead of Hyun-soo. A shorter silence. All right. There's a liquidation in progress on the primary shell accounts. I'm tracking it now, and I need someone with access to the Busan Consortium's external banking contacts to help me trace the terminal destination before the transfer completes. I have 30, she checked the timestamp, 26 minutes before it clears the final routing layer and becomes untraceable. Send me what you have. She transferred the file through the secure system, watching the progress bar with the specific anxiety of someone for whom 26 minutes was not an abstraction. There's a third structural layer I haven't fully mapped. It was incorporated 6 days ago. I need anyone you have with forensic financial access working on it right now. I have 2 people, he said. Give me 5 minutes. She stood at the terminal and gave him 5 minutes and used them to keep pulling thread on the third layer, following the director registration backward through the corporate records. And she was 4 levels into it when the terminal pinged again. Not a transfer alert this time, a security system notification. The penthouse entrance was being accessed. She looked at the security panel. The cameras were still dead. Hyun-soo had killed the feeds, not the motion sensors. And the entrance alert was real-time, triggered by physical contact with the door. Someone was coming in. She looked at the door to the office, looked at the terminal, looked at the transfer tracker showing 22 minutes remaining. She pulled the terminal's data onto her phone through the secure sync, the full file, everything she'd built in the last 2 hours. And she crossed the office to the built-in cabinet against the far wall where she'd seen Jitai open something earlier in the morning, and she did not let herself think too carefully about what she was doing. She just opened the cabinet and looked at the contents and found, on the second shelf, what she'd half expected to find in the private office of the most powerful crime organization in East Asia. A compact black case that was not a difficult thing to identify. She left it where it was. She turned back to the terminal and kept working. The office door opened. Minho looked worse than he had in the parking garage, which was its own information because in the parking garage he'd had the relaxed confidence of a man holding leverage. Now he looked like a man who had been managing a controlled explosion for 6 days and was beginning to understand that controlled explosions have a habit of exceeding their containment parameters. He had 2 people behind him. Not the younger heavy from the parking garage, different people, harder-faced, who positioned themselves at the door with the efficiency of professionals. Minho looked at her standing at the terminal, at the data on the screen, at her phone in her hand. "Step away from the terminal," he said. She didn't move. "The transfer has 20 minutes to clear. You're going to stand here for 20 minutes? "Step away from the terminal, Ms. Brooks." "Why are you here?" She kept her voice level. "Hyun-soo told me I had 48 hours. That was the arrangement." Hyun-soo's arrangement. His jaw was tight. Hyun-soo has been managing his own interests for 31 months, and his interests and mine have not always been identical. She looked at him. "He didn't tell you he was going to make contact with me. He told me you were cooperative." Something moved behind his eyes, the specific anger of a man who had discovered he'd been managed by his own co-conspirator. "He told me you'd agreed to hold the documentation, and you came to verify that personally. I came because in 24 hours I'm leaving this country, and I need to be certain about what exists in this system before I do." She looked at the screen behind her, looked at the transfer tracker. 19 minutes. "There's a third layer," she said, "one you didn't build, incorporated 6 days ago. You know about it." Something shifted in his face. "The Busan Consortium built it without you," she said slowly, reading his expression with the same precision she read financial documents. "They told you the exit structure was bilateral, your money and theirs, through the same routing, but 6 days ago they built a parallel exit they didn't tell you about." She paused. "How much of your money is in the primary shell versus the parallel structure?" Minho's face did something complicated. "All of it," she said. "Your share is in the primary shell. Their share, plus yours, which they moved last week, is in the parallel structure. And the liquidation that's been running for the last," she checked, 34 minutes is clearing the parallel structure, not the primary." He stared at her. "They're taking your money," she said. "And in 20 minutes, when that transfer clears, the primary shell, where your funds are sitting, is going to be the only documented financial structure, which means it's the one that gets found when the investigation starts, which means you take the full exposure while they walk away with everything." The silence in the room was absolute. One of the men at the door shifted. Minho didn't look at him. He was looking at Amara with an expression that had moved entirely beyond the territory of controlled leverage into something rawer and more dangerous. "You can verify this right now," she said. "I'll pull the parallel structure data on screen. You can see exactly where your money isn't." "How did you find it?" he said. His voice was different, stripped of the corporate smoothness. "I'm very good at this," she said, "which is why you should let me finish tracing it. Because the parallel structure terminal account is still traceable for," she checked the screen, 17 minutes. After that, it's gone. Minho looked at the screen, looked at her. His breathing had changed. She could see it, the shallower rhythm of a man whose entire architecture of the next 24 hours was being demolished in real time. "Why would you help me?" he said. "I'm not helping you," she said. "I'm helping Ji Tai. The money in that parallel structure belongs to his organization. If I can trace the terminal account, the Busan Consortium doesn't get to walk away clean." He looked at her for a long moment. The two men at the door were very still. "Move," he said to her, not threateningly, making space. She stepped aside from the primary terminal and let him look at the screen, because she needed him looking at the screen and not at her, and she used the 6 seconds his eyes were moving across the data to send the parallel structure trace to Sung Jin's line with a single message: priority. This first. Her phone buzzed almost immediately. On it. 2 minutes. Minho straightened up from the screen. His face had settled into something cold and focused, the expression of a man converting shock into operational problem-solving, which was a mode she recognized because she'd been in it for the last 2 hours herself. "You need the parallel structure traced," he said. "I have contacts in the routing jurisdiction who can accelerate the terminal account identification." "Call them," she said. He pulled his phone, moved to the window, began speaking in rapid Korean too low and fast for her to follow, but she wasn't focused on the content. She was focused on the two men at the door, who were focused on Min-ho, and she was focused on the terminal, where Sung Jin's team had just sent back an initial trace result that pushed the parallel structure 2 layers deeper and gave her a name. The holding company director. The one incorporated 6 days ago. The name was not one she recognized from the Busan Consortium's known organizational structure. She put it into the cross-reference database and got no result. She ran it against the broader organizational contacts network Jitai's technical systems held and got a match. Not a Busan match. A match inside Jitai's own organization. A name attached to a logistics subsidiary in the Northeastern Distribution Network, flagged as inactive, technically dissolved 8 months ago. 8 months ago. Right after the gala. Right after the assassination attempt that the organization had traced to the Busan Consortium. She sat down because her legs made the decision without consulting her, and she stared at the name on the screen and understood, with the horrible, clear-eyed certainty of a pattern that had just completed itself, that the third layer was not the Busan Consortium's construction. It was internal. Someone inside Jitai's own organization had built the exit structure, had been working with the Busan Consortium not as an external enemy, but as a coordinated partner. Coordinated from inside, from a position of trust, with access to the organizational financial systems and the security rotations and the vulnerability mapping that had made 8 months of preparation possible. Not Hyun-soo. She'd already placed Hyun-soo in the architecture, and this sat above it. She pulled the subsidiary registration, found the parent entity, traced the authorization chain. The authorization chain led to a senior organizational captain, a man named Jang Woo-chul, whose name she knew from 3 years of schedule management, who sat on Jitai's inner council, who had been present at the gala the night of the shooting, who had been present tonight when Jitai left the penthouse. She was still looking at the screen when Minho ended his call and turned from the window. "My contact can flag the terminal account in 11 minutes, he said. "But I need—" "Jang Woo-chul," she said. Minho went completely still. "He's the internal architect," she said. "He built the third layer. He's been running the coordination with Busan from inside the council for 8 months. She looked up from the screen. "Is Jitai with him right now?" The silence that followed was the most terrifying of the night. Minho's face had gone the color of old concrete. "I don't— Is Jitai with Woo-chul right now?" Her voice came out harder than she'd intended. Not professional, not controlled, something that had been stripped of all those layers and was just direct and urgent and afraid. "Yes or no?" Minho looked at the two men at the door. Some communication passed between them that she couldn't read. Then he looked back at her and said, "Yes." She dialed Sung Jin before he'd finished the word. "Woo-chul," she said when it connected. "He has Ji-tai, not Hyun-soo. Woo-chul. Find the location." A sharp sound on the line, but not surprise, but the sound of information snapping into place. "I have 2 of our people with Woo-chul's security team right now. They were told it was a council security drill." "It's not a drill." "No." His voice had shifted into something very flat and very decided. "No, it isn't. How fast can you get to him?" 20 minutes, maybe 15. She looked at the transfer tracker. 9 minutes to completion. Sung Jin. She kept her voice even. If you get to him first, if you reach Ji-Tai before that transfer clears, he needs to know about Wu Chul before he talks to anyone on the council. Anyone, including people he trusts. A brief pause. Understood. She ended the call. The office was very quiet. Minho was standing by the window. The two men were at the door. The transfer tracker moved with the indifferent patience of financial systems, counting down the last 9 minutes of the Busan Consortium's 31-month construction. Minho said, "You're not going to let me walk out of here." She looked at him across the terminal. The man who had blackmailed her in an office and sent someone to put hands on her in a parking garage and smiled the smile of a man who believed he understood leverage. He looked different now, smaller somehow, without the architecture of the scheme behind him. Just a man who had made a series of decisions over 31 months and was standing in a room where those decisions had run out of road. "No," she said, "the Busan money will be traced to the terminal account with or without your contact's help. I have Sung Jin's team working it." She turned back to the screen. "Your best outcome right now is cooperation, and you know it." He was quiet for a moment. "The child," he said. Not a threat this time, something else. "The child is his." "Yes?" "Then you understand what it means that Wu Chul is in that room with him." She kept her eyes on the screen. "I understand. Because if Wu Chul has spent 8 months preparing this and tonight is the execution..." He stopped. His voice was not the corporate voice or the blackmailer's voice. It was something flatter and more honest. He's not going to leave a loose end. The baby moved. A long, slow roll, the way it did sometimes when she was sitting still, as if asserting its own indifferent existence against the weight of everything pressing in from outside. She pressed her hand flat against her side and watched the transfer tracker and thought about Jitae's voice on the phone. Amara, rough and close, a man holding himself together in a room he hadn't chosen. And she thought about the look on his face when he'd felt the baby kick, and the way he'd looked at the city at 5:30 in the morning and said, "I'm not my father," with the quiet absoluteness of a vow. 7 minutes. Her phone buzzed. Sung Jin. "Location confirmed. Moving now." 6 minutes. The terminal pinged. Minho's contact had flagged the routing layer. The parallel structure was now visible 2 levels deeper, the terminal account resolving into clarity, and she grabbed it and cross-referenced it and pushed the full trace to Sung Jin's line in a single transfer. 5 minutes. Minho was still by the window. He hadn't moved toward her or the terminal. She registered this without fully understanding it, and then he said quietly, "For what it's worth, in the garage, I told him not to touch your stomach." She looked at him. His face was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "I needed the documentation changed. I didn't need..." He stopped. "It wasn't supposed to go that way." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's not worth much," she said. "No," he said. "I know." 4 minutes. Her phone went off. Not Sung Jin, not a number she recognized. She answered. Jitae's voice came through the line, and it was different from the controlled roughness of the earlier call. It was sharp and close and completely, dangerously present. And behind it, she could hear the sounds of a space that was not quiet. Voices, movement, something that might have been a door. "I'm out," he said. "Talk to me." Wu Chul is the internal architect. Third structural layer, incorporated 6 days ago, running coordination with Busan from inside the council for 8 months. The liquidation transfer has, she checked, 3 minutes to completion, and I have the terminal account traced and ready to move on your authorization. A sound that wasn't quite a breath and wasn't quite a word. "The council meeting tonight," he said. He called it, under the security drill cover. "I know. He was going to..." He stopped. Didn't finish it. Didn't need to. "Hyun-soo got me out 40 seconds ago." She closed her eyes briefly, opened them. "Hyun-soo is compromised, 31 months, co-signatory on the primary shell." "I know." His voice was flat. "He told me. On the way out. All of it." A pause. "He got me out anyway." 2 minutes. The transfer, she said. Jitai, I need your authorization to freeze the terminal account. I have the account details. I have Sungjin's team standing by, but the freeze requires your direct authorization code and I need it in the next. Give me the account number. She read it from the screen. She heard him repeat it to someone. Heard a voice responding. Sungjin, she thought. Heard the sound of a code being entered somewhere. 1 minute. The transfer tracker was at 58 seconds. 55. 52. She stood at the terminal with her hand flat on the desk and watched the counter move and did not breathe, and Min-ho was behind her by the window, and the two men were at the door, and the baby was still under her palm, steady and present and entirely unaware of 50 seconds, 40, 30. The tracker stopped. Not at 0. At 22 seconds. The word frozen appeared across the transfer status in red, and beneath it the authorization timestamp, and beneath that the account balance. Locked, flagged, visible, traceable, belonging now to a forensic process that would take it apart layer by layer until every name attached to it was exposed. She exhaled. The sound she made was not professional or controlled. It was just the sound of air leaving a body that had been holding it for too long. Jitae's voice in her ear. Done? Done, she said. A silence. Then, are you all right? And the question. The same question he'd asked in the penthouse when she'd arrived from the parking garage. The same words, but carrying now the weight of everything that had happened between then and this moment. Landed somewhere unguarded, and she felt her throat close briefly before she got it back. Yes, she said. I'm 20 minutes out. Okay. Amara. His voice dropped. Something in it that had no operational content. Don't move. She looked at the screen. At the frozen transfer. At the name Jongwoo Chul in the authorization chain, sitting there patient and damning in the system he'd built to disappear. She looked at Min-ho by the window. He was looking at his phone with the expression of a man watching the last exit close. She looked at the two men at the door, who were looking at each other with the particular calculation of professionals reassessing which side of a situation they were on. I'm not going anywhere, she said. She set the phone down and stood at the terminal and waited. And the city moved outside the glass in the mid-morning light, and somewhere 20 minutes away, Kang Ji-tae was moving toward this room with the specific velocity of a man who had just survived a betrayal from inside his own council and understood, completely and finally, the exact shape of what he was coming back. He came through the door at 17 minutes, not 20. She heard the elevator before she heard him, the mechanical sound of it arriving at the penthouse level. The doors, the footsteps that she recognized after 3 years the way you recognize a sound that has structured your daily life. But these footsteps were different from the ones she knew, faster, heavier, in a way that wasn't weight, but intention. The office door opened. Jitae looked like a man who had passed through something and not yet come out the other side. His jacket was gone. His collar was open, 1 button, then 2, the careful tailoring of the man who had walked into the Grand Celestia ballroom 17 days ago, slightly undone by a night that had undone a great many things. There was a cut along his left jawline, shallow, already clotting, that he either hadn't noticed or had decided not to address. His eyes moved across the room in the sequence she recognized. Threat assessment, personnel inventory, exit points. It took him less than 2 seconds. Then his eyes found her and stopped. He crossed the room. He didn't say anything. He put both hands on her face, just held her face between his palms, and looked at her with an expression that had no professional content whatsoever. That was just a man making certain with his hands that a person was real and present and unharmed. And she let him because she was tired enough that she had no architecture left for maintaining distance, and because his hands were shaking slightly, which was the first time in 3 years she had seen anything about him shake. I'm all right, she said. He exhaled, dropped his hands, stepped back and became operational again, the transition happening in the space of 1 breath, and she watched it happen and understood it for what it was. Not coldness, but the habit of a man who had survived by converting emotion into function the moment the immediate crisis allowed. He looked at the screen, at the frozen transfer, at Min-ho, still by the window, who had not moved in 17 minutes, and who looked now like a man who had finished making calculations and arrived at a number he didn't like. Sungjin came in behind Ji-tae and 2 others she recognized from the organizational structure, and the room rearranged itself into something different, The two men who'd been at the door since Minho arrived, making the specific stillness of people who had just watched leverage evaporate. Jitae looked at Minho. The silence between them lasted a long time. Minho said, "I want to make a statement." "You'll make one," Jitae said. "Later, somewhere else." "I want it on record that I gave her the time she needed. The terminal account, I know what you did." Jitae's voice was flat, not angry, the absence of anger that was more final than anger. "It'll be considered." Minho looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man accepting the terms of a situation he'd helped create, and he walked toward Sung Jin's people, and he went without resistance, which was its own kind of accounting, a man who had run out of moves and knew it. The two men at the door went the same way, quietly. The room emptied in under 2 minutes, and then it was Jitae and Amara and Sung Jin, who looked at Jitae and received some communication through a look and moved to the outer office and closed the door behind him. Jitae turned to the terminal. He looked at the screen for a long time, at Wu Chul's name in the authorization chain, at the 31 months of architecture laid out in Amara's clean, merciless documentation, at the name Park Hyun-soo in the co-signatory field of the primary shell, which was the wound that sat differently from the others. Not a rival, not a corrupt subordinate, but 11 years. She watched him look at it. "He got you out," she said quietly. "Yes. That matters." Jitae's jaw was tight. "I know it matters. Whatever comes next for him, it should matter." He turned and looked at her. Something in his face was very tired. Not the operational exhaustion of a long night, but something deeper, the specific tiredness of a man who has discovered that the architecture of loyalty he built his world on has faults he didn't see. "You're defending him. I'm saying he made 31 months of bad choices under coercion, and then when it counted, he made one right one." She met Jitae's eyes. "I've been making a calculation about what people are capable of for the last 6 months, and I've been wrong about it more than once tonight. I'm just noting that." He looked at her for a moment. "You're noting it about yourself," he said. She didn't answer that because the answer was yes, and he knew it. He turned back to the screen. "Wu Chul, 8 months. Possibly longer. The subsidiary dissolution was 8 months ago, but the relationship could predate it. The forensic trail will take time to fully map. He was in the council for 6 years. I know. He was at the gala." Jitae's voice didn't change. It stayed flat and even, and that was worse than if it had broken. "He was standing 12 feet from me when the shooter fired." She said nothing. "He called the security drill tonight. He was the one who told me Hyun-soo had found Min-ho. He handed me the information that got me in the car." He paused. "He was managing the whole sequence." "Yes. And if Hyun-soo hadn't—" He stopped. She waited. 40 seconds, he said. "Hyun-soo told me in the car. He'd been deciding for 40 seconds whether to let it go. 11 years, 31 months of this, and he decided in 40 seconds. She thought about 40 seconds, about what a person could hold in 40 seconds. The weight of a betrayal, the weight of a consequence, the weight of a choice that couldn't be undone once made in either direction. "What will you do with him?" she said. Jitae was quiet for a long moment. "He's out. Of the organization permanently. Everything associated with the scheme is seized. His personal accounts, the properties connected to the shell structure. He cooperates fully with the forensic process." A pause. "He doesn't go to the police. Neither does any of this. It gets handled inside." And Wu Chul, the silence this time was different. "That's not something I'll discuss," he said. She accepted that. She didn't agree with everything it implied, but she accepted it because she was standing inside a world that operated by its own logic, and she'd made a choice to be inside it, and part of that choice was understanding which things were hers to weigh in on and which things were not. "Okay," she said. He turned from the screen. He looked at her, fully, the way he'd looked at her in the lounge at 2 a.m, 17 days ago, when the walls had been down and they'd been 2 people in a locked room discovering the other person was more than they'd assumed. But there was more in the look now. More weight, more history, more of the specific knowledge that only came from having been through something together. "You should sit down," he said. "I've been sitting down for 2 hours. You've been running a forensic financial trace under duress for 2 hours, he said. That's not the same thing. She sat down. Not because he said it, because her body had been waiting for permission, and the exhaustion arrived the moment she stopped moving, settling into her joints and the muscles of her lower back, and the specific bone-deep tiredness of a pregnancy that had been managing stress for months. Jitai pulled the other chair and sat down beside her, close the way he'd sat that morning at 5:30. He didn't touch her. He just sat, and they were both quiet for a while. And outside the glass, Seoul moved through its mid-morning with the complete indifference of a city that did not track the private catastrophes of its inhabitants. The baby, he said. Fine. Moving. The doctor confirmed last night, before all of this. He nodded, his hands were on his knees, and he looked at them briefly. The hands that had been shaking when he held her face, and then looked at the window. I owe you an honest conversation, he said. She looked at him sideways. We've had several tonight. Not about this. He was quiet for a moment, assembling something. She had learned in 3 years that Jitai did not speak imprecisely when precision mattered to him. He took his time, and the time was worth something. What you said last night, that you hid the pregnancy because of what this world would do to you, because you'd be managed. Yes. You weren't wrong about the world, he said. You were wrong about me. Those are different things, and I need you to understand that I know the difference. She was still. I've been running this organization since I was 32 years old, he said. I've made every decision about every person in it based on function and risk and strategic value. That's not... He stopped, started again. That's not how I want to make decisions about you, or about our child. She looked at him. Then how? He met her eyes, like they're mine. Like you're... He stopped again, and she could see him working against something, some deeply embedded resistance to the kind of language that didn't have operational function, and she watched him push through it. Like this matters more than the organization, more than the strategy, more than the management of risk. She held his gaze. That's a significant claim. I know. You've built your entire life on the organization being the priority. I know that too. And you're telling me that changes. I'm telling you it already has. His voice was quiet and completely certain. The moment that baby kicked against my hand, it already changed and I can't undo it, and I'm not trying to. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the woman who had stood in her apartment bathroom 3 months ago with a positive test and done the cold math of survival and decided that disappearing was the only viable option. She thought about the exit strategy and the packed suitcase and the 9 days that had dissolved into something she hadn't planned for and couldn't have. She thought about what it had cost to be here instead. The parking garage, the penthouse, the 5:30 conversation and the 48 hours that wasn't what it claimed to be. The terminal account and Min Ho by the window and Jitai's voice on the phone, Amara, with 22 seconds left on the tracker. None of it had been what she planned. All of it had been real. I need you to understand something, she said. He waited. I'm not going to be managed by you, by the organization, by anyone in it. The decisions about our child, his name, how he grows up, what he knows about this world and when, those are joint, genuinely joint, not discussions where you've already decided and I'm given the option to agree. Agreed. And I'm not a strategic asset. I'm not a financial weapon you deploy when the numbers need restructuring. What I did tonight, I did because I chose to. That choice belongs to me, not to my employment status or my proximity to you. I know who you are, he said. I knew it before tonight. I just didn't say it. She held his eyes. Say it now. A beat. Something moved across his face, not the operational calculation she was used to reading there, something that didn't have a professional category. You're the most capable person I've ever had in this building, he said. You're also the most honest person I've ever been in a locked room with, which is rarer than capable, and I've known that for longer than one night 17 days ago. He paused. And you're the mother of my child, and I would like to spend the considerable remaining time in my life proving to you that those 3 things can coexist in one man without any of them being used against you. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had been through enough in the last 12 hours that language had temporarily reached its limit, and what remained was just the physical fact of being alive and in the same room, which was not a small thing. She said, Okay. He looked at her. Okay. Don't make me regret it. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. The same almost smile from the lounge, but fuller now, more arrived. I'll try not to. Wu Chul was found at 11:47 that morning in a vehicle on the Mapo Bridge approach. His phone dead, his personal accounts showing 3 transfers to jurisdictions that indicated he'd understood the sequence was over. Sung Jin's people reached him before he reached wherever he was going. The conversation that followed was not one Amara was present for or asked about, and Jitai came back to the penthouse 2 hours later with the cut on his jaw cleaned and dressed, and nothing further was said about Zhang Wuchul in her presence. She understood this was how some things ended in the world she'd chosen to stay inside. And she sat with that understanding the way you sit with something that is true and imperfect and yours. The Busan Consortium's terminal account, frozen by Jitai's authorization at 22 seconds, was formally seized through a process that involved 3 legal jurisdictions and took 11 days. The forensic trail, built from the documentation Amara had compiled, and the parallel structure work she'd done in the 2 hours before Jitai came through the door, was clean enough to make the consortium's options limited. A settlement was negotiated. The terms were not made public. The consortium's territorial moves against Kang Logistics' Eastern Distribution Network stopped with the abruptness of a switch being thrown. Minho's cooperation was complete and documented. He was stripped of every financial asset connected to the scheme, which was most of them, and permanently exited from the country under terms that left him alive and outside a prison, but without the infrastructure he'd spent 31 months building. He did not contest the terms. He signed everything placed in front of him with the resigned efficiency of a man who had looked at his options and found only one that wasn't catastrophic. Hyunsu was a longer and more complicated process. He was removed from his position the morning after, formally, in a meeting that Amara was not part of and that Jitai did not describe in detail afterward. What she knew, Hyunsu cooperated fully, provided complete documentation of his 31-month involvement, and identified 3 additional organizational contacts who had been feeding information to the Busan Consortium in capacities below Wu Chul's. He was not prosecuted. He was not exiled. He was given a severance and a silence agreement, and he disappeared from the organization's structure quietly. The way people who had been genuinely trusted and had genuinely failed sometimes got to disappear, with their life intact and the weight of the failure carried privately. Jitai told her this over dinner 10 days later in the apartment she had chosen, the 4th floor of a secured building in Yongsan-gu, with windows that faced north and a second bedroom and a security arrangement that she had reviewed and approved before signing the lease. He had asked to come to dinner and she had said yes, and he had cooked, which was something she had not known he could do until she watched him do it. And they had eaten in the kitchen because the table in the dining room still had unpacked boxes on it, and neither of them had mentioned moving them. The 40 seconds, she said. He looked at her. When Hyunsu decided, in the car. You said he'd been deciding for 40 seconds. He told me he'd been deciding since he saw you in the parking garage, Jitai said. Not 40 seconds, months. She was quiet. He said watching you in the parking garage, seeing the way you protected the baby, the instinct of it. He said he understood for the first time what the scheme was actually taking from. Jitai set his fork down. Not money. Not organizational structure. He said it was the first time in 31 months that the abstraction became a person. She thought about that. About the specific weight of being seen, finally, after months of careful invisibility, in the worst possible circumstances, and having it be the thing that mattered. That's a complicated thing to do with, she said. Yes. I don't forgive him, she said. I want to be clear about that. I know, but I understand that human beings contain more than one thing simultaneously. She picked up her glass, which is something I've been learning at an accelerated pace recently. The corner of his mouth moved. Recently. In the last 3 weeks, she said, specifically. They sat in the kitchen of her new apartment with the city outside and the unpacked boxes in the dining room and the quiet that had become, in the 10 days since the penthouse, and the frozen transfer and Jitai's hands shaking against her face, a different kind of quiet from any she'd known before. Not the quiet of concealment, not the quiet of managed distance, just the quiet of 2 people who had been through something and were still here, in the same room, choosing to be. The baby came 6 weeks early, which the doctors had anticipated given the accumulated stress of the pregnancy and which Amara faced with the same clear-eyed pragmatism she brought to everything she couldn't control. She was at the apartment when the labor started, and Jite was there, had taken to being there most evenings, staying later each time, in a gradual recalibration of proximity that neither of them had formalized or announced. And he drove her to the hospital himself, which she noted was the first time she'd ever seen him drive his own vehicle. The labor was long, 14 hours, which was not unusual, but which was also not short, and Jite stayed for all of it. He sat beside her and he held her hand when she allowed it, and he was quiet when she needed quiet, and he got the ice chips and he fielded the 2 phone calls from Sung Jin with a brevity that communicated clearly that organizational business was not currently the priority. She watched him make those calls, stepping to the far corner of the room, 2 sentences each, eyes on her the whole time, and she thought about the man she'd described to herself 3 years ago. A function, not a person. Someone who operated on a frequency where she didn't register. That man felt a long time ago. At 4:17 in the morning, her son arrived. He was small, 6 weeks early. He was going to be small, and he was screaming before the doctor had finished, and the sound of it was the most immediate thing Amara had ever experienced, cutting through the exhaustion and the pain and the long, strange months of fear, like something that didn't need context, that was just itself and demanded to be heard. They placed him on her chest. She put her hands on him, both hands, feeling the astonishing aliveness of him, the specific heat and weight and movement, and said nothing because there was nothing available that came close to being adequate. She looked up. Jite was standing at the side of the bed and his face was, she would remember this, would carry this particular image for the rest of her life, completely unguarded. Completely without the operational surface, without the closed, careful control she'd spent 3 years reading variations of. He was just a man looking at his son for the first time, and he was not holding himself together. He reached out one hand and touched the baby's head. Barely a touch. His fingers were careful in a way she had not seen them be careful before, and the baby moved against the contact, turned fractionally toward the warmth of it. Jite made a sound, low, caught in his throat. He turned away for a moment toward the window, and his shoulders moved once, and she let him have the privacy of the turned back without comment, because some things deserve to happen without witness. When he turned back, his face was not reassembled the way it usually reassembled. It was just him, the real version, the one underneath, with the eyes that were red at the edges and the jaw that was working to hold something in. "He's all right," the doctor said quietly. "Both of them are all right." Jite nodded. He reached out and took Amara's free hand. Not the way a man performed gestures, but the way a person held on to something because the alternative was not holding on. And he held it and looked at his son and said, "What do you want to name him?" She'd thought about it. For months, in the quiet of the planning and the fear and the flight she didn't take, she'd thought about it in the private way you thought about things you weren't sure you'd get to keep. "Kang Min-jun," she said. He looked at her. "If that's..." "Yes," he said, simply. No qualification. "Yes." Minjun slept against her chest, and the early morning moved outside the hospital window, and Jite did not let go of her hand. The first corporate gala of the following year was held at the Grand Celestia Hotel. Again. Jite had considered changing the venue and decided against it because changing the venue would have been an acknowledgement that what had happened there had changed something he needed to conceal, and he did not conceal things from his organizational world. He restructured them, which was different. The security arrangements were different. Sungjin now held Hyun-soo's former position, which he occupied with a competence that was less theatrical than his predecessors and more effective. The guest list had been audited. The council had been rebuilt across the previous 8 months with a deliberateness that Amara had observed from the inside because she was inside it now. Formally, structurally, with a role that had been designed around the specific capabilities she demonstrated in a penthouse office in the early hours of a morning that had changed the organization's architecture as thoroughly as it had changed everything else. She stood in front of the mirror in the apartment, her apartment, the one in Yongsan-gu, though Jitae's presence in it had become by this point essentially constant, and she looked at herself. The dress was deep green, her choice, her cut, her size worn without adjustment or apology. Not concealing anything, not performing anything, just worn because she liked it, and because she was going somewhere she had earned the right to be. Minjun was 4 months old and asleep in the next room under the supervision of a woman Jitai trusted and Amara had interviewed twice. Jitai appeared in the doorway of the bedroom. He was in his charcoal suit, the one she'd first watched him wear across a ballroom a lifetime ago. And he looked at her in the mirror without speaking for a moment. "Ready," he said. Not a question. She looked at her own reflection, at the woman in the green dress who had arrived in Seoul 3 years ago to be invisible and useful, and had managed, through a series of choices, some planned and some catastrophically unplanned, to become something else entirely. She thought about this packed suitcase she'd left in a locked penthouse, about the flight she hadn't taken, about the 9 days that had dissolved into a night, a parking garage, a frozen transfer at 22 seconds, and a baby's name said in a hospital room at 4:17 in the morning. None of it had been what she planned. She turned from the mirror. "Ready?" she said. They came through the Grand Celestia's ballroom entrance together. Jitae moved the way he always moved, with the forward momentum of a man who had never learned how to be tentative about space. And she moved beside him, not 12 feet behind, not 3 steps to the left, not in the peripheral orbit of someone useful and forgettable. She felt the room register her. The specific recalibration that happened across a space when a known thing appeared in an unexpected configuration. The people who had seen her for 3 years as the secretary with the leather portfolio and the oversized blazer, she watched them take her in and take in the fact of her position beside Jitae, and make the rapid, belated adjustment of people who had missed something obvious for a long time. She did not perform anything for them. She didn't need to. Sung Jin met them at the floor. He nodded to Jitae and then looked at Amara and said, directly and without qualifier, "The Eastern Accounts projection you sent this morning. The board wants to discuss it tonight." "Tell them after dinner," she said. "I'll have the supplemental figures ready." "Yes." He nodded once and moved off. Jitae glanced at her sideways, the corner of his mouth. "Don't," she said. "I didn't say anything. You were going to." "I was going to say that in 3 years I never once had my board told to wait until after dinner." "Your board," she said, "clearly needed someone willing to do that." He laughed, an actual laugh, quiet and genuine, in the middle of the Grand Celestia ballroom, which she suspected was something this room had not heard from him before. A few people in the immediate vicinity registered it and looked, because Kang Ji-tai laughing was something you looked at. She looked at the room, at the faces that were watching them, some calculating, some uncertain, some simply curious about the woman who had arrived in green and was standing where no one had stood beside Ji-tai before. She looked at the geography of the space she'd moved through invisibly for 3 years, the positions she'd occupied, the conversations she'd orbited without being included, the particular practice blindness people developed for people they'd decided not to see. She had spent a long time believing that blindness was a condition she had to accept, that the world's inability to see her was a fact she could only route around, never confront. She understood now that she'd been wrong, not because the world had changed, it hadn't, not really. People were still going to make lazy calculations about what she was and what she was capable of. That particular machinery didn't stop. What changed was whether she was inside the room or outside it when the machinery ran. Jitae's hand found the small of her back, a light touch, not proprietary, present. The way a person made contact with another person to say, "I know you're here," without needing to say it out loud. She let it stay. A cluster of senior executives ahead, the ones who had sat at the head table and given her polite professional nods for 3 years, and whose names she knew better than they knew hers, registered their approach. She watched the adjustments happen in real time, the straightening, the slight uncertainty, the recalibration. She walked through it, beside the most feared man in East Asia, carrying the weight of everything she'd been through to arrive here, wearing a green dress she'd chosen because she liked it. Amara Brooks walked through the Grand Celestia ballroom and did not fold herself smaller for anyone in it. She thought about Minjun asleep in the apartment, the weight of him on her chest, the sound he'd made at 4:17 in the morning when he arrived in the world and announced himself to it without apology. She understood that now, the thing he'd done, without knowing he was doing it, just arriving, just being present and loud and entirely himself, demanding to be registered. She had not always known how to do that. She was learning.